Hey, I'm Salman Moti. I'm the Director of Quality Analytics at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas, Texas. And I also teach in healthcare informatics, database programming, database design, portfolio development, um, that sort of space. I'm also active in global health projects, primarily in East Africa, Central Asia, and most of that work I've been doing for the better part of 10 decade or better part of a decade, if not more. So I'm glad to join you today and look forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Salman. I'm very excited to have you on the podcast. And yeah, and I think from what you've shared, there's quite a bit we can unpack about kind of the work that you do. It seems to be very different work in terms of how you manage projects, how you teach courses, and how you think about very big issues and how to address them with probably diverse team members, right? Bringing in different skill sets. So yeah, what you shared, some of it kind of went over my head already. So we definitely have to go back into it because yeah, I'm really curious to really understand like how you approach the work that you do and why you do the work that you do. So yes, thank you so much. And to kind of get us started, if you can kind of speak a little bit more about the milestones of your career, maybe thinking back to like when, like what kind of like led you on the path that you are right now. This could be both from like the professional lens, but also the personal lens of like what drives you and what were some forks in the road that got you to where you are right now.
Yeah, happy to chat with you about that. There's a couple of things that come to mind immediately, and I'll kind of go down the professional academic route first, and kind of pepper in some personal milestones along the way. So I'd say as I was wrapping up my undergrad, it was in economics. It was pretty clear that I was going to end up in some type of um, financial services type company that kind of incentivizes that sort of skill set in the marketplace, right? And so that's kind of where I landed. My first stop was in banking and finance, and spent a number of years there. What I ended up learning was that the role was great, the people were great. I was just looking for a different type of intellectual challenge in the financial industry. A lot of the rules are already written, they get updated from time to time, and it's really about applying the right rule in the right situation, kind of thing, to to move forward. And I wanted something that was a little less structured and a little more fast paced than that. And I know most people will seek clarity, but I was kind of seeking ambiguity, something where I could create something from scratch, find some new ideas that I could engage with. And this was around the same time that the High Tech Act was coming into place in healthcare, which is really where technology started to become infused into medicine. Prior to that, you were looking at really just major academic medical centers in the country that did electronic record keeping, or um, having databases, or things like that. Most of the other applications were done on paper, right? All the record keeping was done that way. And when the High Tech Act kind of went into place, it opened up a whole new skill set that could contribute in the healthcare space, and that's where I got my foot in the door into healthcare. So my first master's was in healthcare administration, and then I spent some time doing clinical research at Mayo Clinic, and then I did patient safety and risk type work here in North Texas with another nonprofit health system, and those were great experiences. And as I was kind of navigating that professional capacity, I had the itch to return to school, and I think the MHA program that I started was was kind of right at the right time in the right place, kind of thing. And it helped me understand how do organizations in healthcare function. What do they think about? What do they care about? How do they get better when they think about those things? What does better even mean for them, right? And so the MHA kind of fit into that bucket. So that's the administration side of the work. And as I started working in that space, I started to think a lot about this work is a lot about how does one organization get better over time, not necessarily how does the community get better over time. And so that led me to do a master's in public health, and that was a lot of thinking about how do societies progress as they take advantage of the things that are in the marketplace, whether those be public health projects or whether they're private industry type things, but what are the things that are impacting the lives of people around us. And then that led me into the next chapter, which was thinking about how do you actually make something in public health sustainable? Because kind of an underlying theme in a lot of public health projects is at some point the money will run out and you'll have to decide what to do then. And I didn't really find that response very satisfying. And so I decided to do an MBA to learn about how do you start an organization, make it financially stable enough to operate for a long period of time, establish vision, mission, marketing, all of the support services that you might need to go along with that. And as I was wrapping that up, I landed on the insight that I'd spent many years in the knowledge consumption space, right? There's a lot of these like leaders and experts that contribute to that, and I was just absorbing that every opportunity that I got, and that led me to an interest in knowledge creation. So that was kind of a bridge that I was trying to navigate. How do you get from knowledge consumption into knowledge creation? And that answer was very clear, right? You have to get some type of terminal degree so you can contribute to scholarly work in that space. So that brought me into a doctoral program. And when I finished that, I was left with more questions again. And that brought me into the master's program that you and I share now, because as I was thinking about knowledge creation, it got me asking questions around what good is the creation of that knowledge if you can't establish the structures and the systems to communicate that to others, to scale it, right? And so that's what brought me into the program that we're in now. And so right now I serve as the director of quality analytics in North Texas for an academic medical center. And that work is super interesting. And we are kind of set up as a hybrid model. So it's kind of a part think tank, part consultancy that lives in-house. So effectively, the only things that we get to work on are ones that are brand new questions. There's not a precedent for answering this. So we have to invent a way to answer a question that's not been asked before. And we have to figure out how do you set up the data systems? How do you ask the right question to get the right response and make that something that a leader can consume and then make a good decision from? So I think we support in that capacity. So kind of shifting to the personal side of the equation there, along that journey, also had a couple of kids, right? And that taught me a lot about how do you think about how people process information, right? Because you have this like brand new baby that's never had exposure to other things than what you have brought to them. And they're developing their own ideas and interest in music. And right now I can't, get away from Taylor Swift because it plays on every speaker we've got in the home. And, so I think kids have a lot to do with the shape that I've taken in terms of my trajectory. And then one of the other experiences that I had that actually wrapped up here in the last year was that on the community, it's called communities of interpretation that land on the Muslim faith, right? There are different sects that you might be able to dissect those. So I'm on that spectrum around the Shia Imami Ismaili Muslims side of that. And within that, there's pastoral care duties that people from the congregation are selected to run on a daily basis, right? So for the last 4 years, 7 days a week, I've served in that capacity. So running evening services for the congregation, administering, the rites of passages, right? So kids are born, people converting to the faith, marriages and deaths, and all of those things. And those are things that I've done for the last almost half decade, and that's had a lot of influence on how I think about my own journey and how others are trying to navigate similar things, but in very different ways because their lives are different, right? And so I hope that helps answer some of your question there.
Wow, that was a lot, but amazing because you've done so much with your career in terms of like the education that you've done. You have many degrees. It's very clear. But I think what's really driven you was this kind of like search for like what's really happening out there, right? This tendency, like a lot of us to kind of just want the quick solution. You, on the other hand, was like, let me lean into the complexity because there's something more here. And so I find that to be very unique because I think it just speaks to your curiosity, right? You started in like finance, and I'll be very honest. When you said banking and finance was the start of your career, I was like, oh, that's that sounds, very intimidating. We're taking this finance course, and we've talked about this, or I've shared about my own kind of feeling of like, wow, what does that all mean? But it's incredible how like from banking and finance, you've been able to kind of like explore such interesting, kind of like landscapes of like other professional fields and how this search for like more ambiguity, as you said, and rather than the safe path, it's led you into the field of well, actually, it was like an emerging field, right? You said the high tech act, right? Being able to really be at the forefront of what was going on in medicine and technology, and to continuously better yourself through more studies. I feel like you've gotten almost every single degree you can possibly get. Are you planning to get a law degree after after this? Um,
If you can convince my wife to invest in that, I think we can chat about that. But I don't know that I have any more capital to expend. I think I've used it all up there.
I know. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
because like when you st shared all of that, it just seems like it just one thing led to the next, led to the next. But you also explained how like when you got, for example, the master's in healthcare administration, like it was very natural with like what you were engaged with at the time, and I feel like that's really yeah, it's really compelling to like throw yourself into a new field, assess, questions come up, and then you'd kind of taking action, pushing forward. And so yeah, so that was quite a bit. I feel though that like this theme of the ambiguity and pursuit of knowledge are really important to you, or like the curiosity of it, right? The kind of bigger questions. And I'm curious, like what would you say were some of your early like influences before even getting into undergrad, that kind of set you like to like really value study? Because I think you're probably one of like you in our program probably the one who has the most degrees there is. But it comes from that core value of like study and education is important. So would you say there was like any particular influence on you in terms of how you approached seeking these answers to these many questions?
Yeah, I think that's actually a great question. When I reflect on that, I think a lot of it has to go back to some of the life experiences that I've had. Right, I wasn't born in the U.S. I was born in Pakistan, and I immigrated to the U.S. when I was around what maybe 7 years old. And at the time, you've I understood the language, relatively well, and but some of the nuances around slang and the environment, social cues, and things like that, very different types of things, right? And I remember thinking very distinctly, like some of the terms that I would use mean very different things when they're applied in different contexts. But I didn't have exposure to different contexts, so I didn't know any better, right? So you use what you know, kind of thing. And it always made me wonder about like not just what decision was made, but like the process for making that decision. And that's where I spent a lot of my brain power and my interest solving for that. And I eventually came to the realization there's not really, if you're searching for a solution, you're just going to keep searching. Right. And that's kind of where I am. I'm trying to understand. I don't know if there's an answer to some of the questions that I'm asking. And this was actually a discussion that I got into with one of my colleagues earlier, actually just yesterday. she and I were chatting about, we're at work and we're trying to figure out like how do you solve this type of problem, and just organically we ended up in this conversation about, as an organization, we are very, very good at answering questions. We are very good at it. And I think you can draw some parallels to even education, right? It's a search for how do you answer like certain complicated questions. But what we're not as good at, and maybe don't have a lot of training in, is how do you ask a better question? You can answer the question, but if your question isn't good enough, your outcome won't be as good, right? So how do you filter through and figure out what's the best question to ask? And I think that's where my journey has kind of led me through more of the academic side of the world, because all of that is set up to help you figure out how do you answer a question like this. But the the part that really interests me, and that's where I spend kind of most of my social time and engaging with people, is figuring out how do you think about problems, not necessarily can you solve them, because there may be some things you probably can't solve at this point, but where in your mind does this live, and how do you think about it when you start to reach the limits of those ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing the fact that you were born in Pakistan, you immigrated to the US, that shows that you were suddenly confronted with a lot of questions, right? Because of the cultural differences, because of the way in which you interacted with someone, and they kind of perhaps had a perplexing response, or there was like something that just quite didn't connect. And I can see how, like, especially from like, I guess like a young person, you're trying to quickly like make sense of like what is happening in my environment. How can I make this uh you know safe, right? In terms of how I take in information and then, respond in kind. And I think this, question of the question of how to ask better questions, is really evident in your pursuit of like greater understanding, but also in terms of how you've engaged with larger communities within, academic spaces, within, different organizations as well. That makes a lot of sense. And when I think about like how one comes to ask a good question, there can be somewhat of like kind of like solitude of like just thinking about what I wanted, what's going on and making sense of it. But I also find that in like groups or with like another person, that can be really helpful to like kind of come to an aha moment. So, is there any like experience, and again, if you can like maybe draw from like in your younger years, about like maybe a particular individual, a friend, a teacher, but was there any kind of like engagement that you had of like understanding the power of asking a really good question, that kind of like reaffirms a lot of what you were saying about like, oh, from then on, you've constantly sought out better and better questions through study.
Yeah, so I think the one that comes to mind immediately was when I first immigrated to the US. I was in an ESL class, and a lot of the activities that we had were around writing and then kind of reading out loud the stuff that we'd written ourselves. And I remember in those instances that I would ask, not necessarily the teacher, am I doing this right? But asking other students, what did you mean when you said that? Because I'm surrounded by people whose baseline is not the American culture, right? So they may have come from, South or Central America, or, Central Asia or something. But the idea was that their experiences were grounded in something else, but it wasn't necessarily that their experiences were any less. They were just different. And so when they would talk about like their cultural differences, or some of the maybe the holidays that they would celebrate or foods that they would eat, obviously I didn't have exposure to those things, but I was curious, like what does it mean when you say XYZ? Like, and some of those things, and this is really what got my attention. Some of them don't have a direct translation in English, right? And so some of those ideas and concepts, not only are foreign when they are translated, there may not be a translation for them. And being able to understand that piece, I won't understand. it is kind of a hard thing to get over, but it helps form relationships between people that are, from different backgrounds, and kind of contributes to, the theme of the work that you do around global citizenship, to say that it's really about how you organize yourself into groups. Do you see yourself as a group of people and that look like you, that behave like you, that live near you, or do you draw those boundaries differently? And I think one of my early experiences in kind of that ESL class, being able to reflect and engage with people that were different from me, those were not experiences I could have had in other places, right? I think had I not been in an ESL class, it would have been very different, right? More of a homogenous group. They're already kind of primed to enter the education system based on how it's structured. But having had that experience, I have a great appreciation for it.
Wow, that's a great example. Thank you for sharing that. And it's interesting that, your response in, as a, young learner in this ESL class, when you were confronted with something like, oh, here's a concept or an idea that is kind of being shared from a different context, and you're not able to kind of make sense of that, as because of the translation part of it. That can be incredibly frustrating, right, for someone who wants to know. So you could have
Mm-hmm.
either chosen the path of just kind of rejecting that and saying that that doesn't make any sense. That's stupid, right? Like a little kid would say, That's dumb." Or you kind of like took it as like this, maybe from what it sounds like, this kind of like wonder, right? Of like, wow, like what other things are kind of expressed in this way, or how can I reflect more on the way I view the concepts in my own culture or in the
Mm-hmm.
culture around me. And I find that to be a lot more productive, right? A lot more kind of open-minded, which definitely ties into the topic of global citizenship. But yeah, for you to live that experience and for it to be formative enough where it comes to your mind immediately,
Mm-hmm.
that really does speak to everything else that you shared, especially just, with your professional career and understanding that it's not about knowing everything, right? I mean, that's impossible. Um, it's a lot more of like, yeah, the questions that come up and how you kind of internalize those questions, make sense of them, and then like what emerges from that is I think part of what you were saying about like the knowledge creation. It's not just about, just taking in what's already been made, but like building something new. And actually, that's a really great. I'm very curious to know more about what you meant by that. Like, there was this pivotal moment where you were just about to, or you just decided to do the PhD, and that was probably with this notion that, okay, I'm going to contribute to the literature in some form, and that's the knowledge creation part of that. Could you maybe like share a little bit more about like what that process was like for you? Because it seems like before that, everything was about just questions, right? Like kind of going into like complex situations, going across like, different fields like finance, banking, the medical field, and just kind of like and technology, and like so like what was it like for you then to kind of be in the knowledge creation? Like suddenly everyone was saying like you're creating knowledge now. Was that kind of jarring for you?
So I would, I don't know if I would articulate it as jarring, but it was eye-opening. I'd maybe say it that way, uh, for for maybe a different reason than what it might sound like on the surface, right? So I I think if you were to look at my like doctoral work, it's probably like 40% of what I learned. The rest of it was stuff that I learned that couldn't be included in the document for various reasons, right? So like if you look at the dissertation, there's more to the story than is allowable in like a public space kind of thing. But what I would draw attention to is that when I was looking at kind of doing my doctorate in healthcare administration, it was looking at how do organizations function? How do they organize themselves? And are there better ways to do it than have already been discovered? Right. And I wanted to expand my scope in that regard. Obviously, I could have picked a health system in the US or Canada or North America to go after and have those learnings with. But I had the opportunity to go to a former Soviet republic and learn about how they set up their mountaintop hospital, right? A multi-million-dollar hospital got funding, got built. And it's along the Pamiri mountain range that connects to Everest when you get to Nepal. But the idea is that these are high mountain areas, very distinct challenges, very difficult to get to in terms of logistics and supply chain and things like that. And they experience similar problems, but they can't apply the same solutions. And that's where it was, interesting for me to step into those spaces and have those conversations with people where I'm like, yeah, that's an easy fix. But here you have different resources that you have to account for, different people, different politics. And so all of those things kind of factor in. I think one of the eye-opening pieces of that was how the history of the place defined what it found acceptable, what it found as viable solutions. And I won't get into like the technical details of like a healthcare system in a former Soviet republic, but one of the experiences that I had that I completely didn't expect, but I think about all the time is I'm having this conversation with a person that's helping me understand how their work happens and all the inputs and outputs, that sort of thing. And they hand me a cup of tea to drink, very very hospitable. And I take a sip, and the tea is salty, and I'm taken aback. I'm like, this. Why would the tea be salty? Like it would be fine if it didn't have anything, or maybe if it had sugar, but why salt? And that led me down like a rabbit hole of why does this culture add salt to their tea? And as I followed that decision, that has now become a norm. Like when you go to the region, you will be presented with the option to have tea with salt in it. That the reason that it's happening is because when the Soviet Union broke out into the separate republics, the separate countries, they faced a lot of challenges around food and hunger and starvation and things like that. And what they found was if they were able to have their tea in the morning, they got their caffeine, they got some energy that they couldn't get from other calories, but also that salt acted as a appetite suppressant. And so they wouldn't get hungry and they could keep working even though they didn't have the food to eat to sustain themselves, right? And so it was kind of like a practical solution that became a part of the culture. And now when people that haven't lived there, it seems new to them, but it's a very reasonable solution to a problem they were facing. It just has become a part of their society now. And so I think about that all the time because I wonder like what is it that we're doing that seems perfectly normal today, but when somebody from the outside comes in and takes a look, it feels very different, sounds very different. They question like, why does it happen that way? And obviously, you can take a couple of different reactions to an experience like that, right? You can reject and say, that's not for me. That tastes different than what I needed to. Or you can ask questions and learn about people's cultures and figure out, what led you to do this. And sometimes they know, sometimes they don't, but you have the opportunity to find those things out.
Oh, that's a fascinating tidbit of their culture because yeah, I've never heard of salt being put into tea, and I don't know if what you just took a sip of something. Is that salt and is that tea
It's
with some salt in it?
it isn't. So I do have my biases for just regular coffee kind of stuff. But when in Rome, even when not in Rome, I
Yeah.
guess.
No, that's I was just kidding. But yeah, that's it's interesting that you kind of commented on the salt tea as like a rabbit hole, right? But it just I think when a question really takes your imagination and you're like genuinely curious about it, you start to see all of these connections to what you were doing prior to that, right? And the work that you were doing and the research around that particular hospital. And I find that yeah, sometimes that's where like actually like the better questions emerge from, like the unexpected places, like some salt at the bottom of a teacup or something like that.
Mhm.
So I'm really amazed with like this trajectory that you've gone in with, oh, not the trajectory, but just all that you've accomplished, and with your studies and the different work that you've done. And it's just, I'm just curious, like, how does someone like, yourself, like you immigrated from Pakistan, and then let's say at the starting point of like an ESL class, um, what were like some of your like, I don't know, hopes or dreams? Like, what did you think you were going to do in the future? Did you think it would be anything remotely close to where you're at right now as the director of a quality analytics at a medical center?
If 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 I told you that I'd scripted any of this or had any expectations that it would come together this way, I don't know that I'd be completely honest in doing that. So my neither of my parents went to college. The first time that either of them stepped onto a college campus is when they came to, drop me off for my undergrad. Um, and so education was important, but it was important because it was something we couldn't access in the same way where we were, right? So one of the big reasons that we immigrated to the U.S. was the opportunity to pursue higher education at great institutions, right? So I think that was a contributing factor in something like that. When I when I was kind of navigating that pathway of acquiring additional education, kind of going into even an undergrad program, right? I didn't have any resources or points of reference to tell me like this happens next. I would find out there was a deadline and then submit paperwork for it, or miss the deadline and try to figure out how do I get this back, because I didn't know the process. And I remember that when I first applied to college, I got into a different private school for my undergrad, and I had no understanding that this was going to cost me tuition. And they sent a bill that was about as much as my family's income for a year at the time. I was like, there's just no way, right? I don't have financial aid. I don't have like anything. And I just had to put those plans on hold until I could find, like, I could figure out how do I do financial aid now, because I didn't know that was a thing until it was too late. So kind of starting, stopping, but figuring out that some of these challenges aren't necessarily hard stops. They're just pauses along the road, right? They're speed bumps. You're going to get over them. Sometimes you have to slow down to do it. But if you see that your runway is much, much longer, right, then you can plan for some of those things. And when I talk to folks that are thinking about like how do I navigate like a academic trajectory or a professional pathway, that sort of thing, I have them think about, you know, a common practice is to go out and find somebody on LinkedIn that has the job you want to have and see what they've done and try to copy that, right? And in some cases that may work fine. In other instances, what really happens is that you don't factor in time, that it's going to take you X number of years to acquire that skill set, in which case, like, the things that you've learned may have already become outdated, and the person or the people that you're competing with have that many more years of experience doing that work, right? So you can't aim for that same spot. You have to aim ahead of that, and you have to factor in the time to some of those things. And I think as I got better at doing that, it became easier and easier to understand that if I want to start another degree or do a doctorate, that I need to aim like a year in advance, 2 years in advance, because otherwise I may not be able to take advantage of the best opportunities because I'm um, more restricted by resources or some of the other commitments in the short term. So I think being able to see further and further out, and be able to make decisions that way ends up helping the most.
Wow, that actually turned out as like great career advice. Because we often want to like, especially with like our careers, like what we derive a lot of our purpose from, what does the future look like? We we want to work off of templates because that feels very safe. It's
Yeah,
like,
the
oh,
rubrics and things. Yeah,
yeah, exactly, right? I
yeah.
mean, this plus this equals this, and you can move ahead in life. But I think you raise some important considerations about like these kind of intangibles, these factors that are vital, right? Like time. right? Or like how your context, your environment it shapes you in what you're actually doing, like building skills and what have you. And that it's oftentimes the path is going to just emerge as you're walking through it. But this notion of like knowing the runway, as you put it, planning for maybe that one additional year, trying to kind of like glimpse over the mountain that you're trying to hike up. It's part of the process, but it gives you that, advanced notice, right? So you don't feel as if you're going to like come to a dead end, right? Although even dead ends probably are very valuable too. I feel like all of it is about the perspective that one takes. But that drive to kind of continuously advance, I think, is really important. And I'm sure that with your family's efforts, right, your parents to come to the U.S., that was a huge risk, right? In many
Mhm.
ways, I think for all immigrant families. And yet it was based on some kind of driving value. They didn't maybe see the full runway, but they knew that there was this that something was going to change within the family, and clearly it
Yep.
did. Maybe now that you have, a family of your own, you said you have some kids. What has that been like now, like that you are raising, right, your kids? Like, what is that perspective like? Because you said like it's really changed a lot of like how you see the work that you do and how just people develop in general. But yeah, maybe if you could share a little bit about that what that experience has been like and how maybe it differs from the way that your parents might have approached, you know, raising you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I've got two daughters, an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old, and they keep me on my toes. And they know more about almost everything than I knew at their age. And I think that's great. I I have a kind of a sense with them that we're going to do things obviously that are important, right? They have their schoolwork and things like that. But we spend probably as much time, if not more, just figuring out like what's of interest to you now, and let's go figure out how to do that stuff right now. And so, any given time, there's like paint on the walls, canvases are dripping. There's, motors coming apart, and we're working with drills and things. So whatever is kind of their flavor of the month kind of thing, we're trying to figure out how to engage with some of those opportunities. And I think when I reflect on how they're coming up versus how I did, I think mine was a little bit more structured because some of those options weren't open to me, but I also didn't know that they were open to me. So I didn't know that I was missing out on anything. Right. And so I think as my kids kind of navigate that, I see a lot of creativity in them. They see things in a very different way. They're much more comfortable in environments that I wouldn't have been in at their age. And I think I think a factor that I take some pride in is that they are both hilarious. They will like set you up for a joke in a way that you don't even see coming until like you're hit with a punchline. Um, and I admire that about them. Like even early in the mornings, like they'll just be rolling on the floor laughing before it's time for school. And as a dad, you have to kind of engage, right? You have to figure out how can you meet them where they are. And so I have to bring my dad jokes, and those take a little bit of practice to get right. But once you get it, it just comes. And I remember my older daughter Amel. She asked. I was proud of her for asking the question, but I'll tell you kind of how that went. So I remember telling her a joke. I don't remember exactly what it was, and she came back with a question I'd never considered before. I've never been asked the question, and it was a really great question. And so she asked, "Are all dad jokes bad jokes, or are all bad jokes dad jokes?" And I was floored by like the processing of that question. Like it was so clear what she was asking, right? So I mean, the way I answered is that I told her I reject the premise that like I don't think you can put those two things together and expect me to give you an answer, right? So I reject the premise, but I appreciate the question because I think like she was thinking about a few different levels at a time and framing it, and her framing of it was better than like I could have come up with myself. right? And I think she was, and you could tell her reason for asking was that she knew it was partially a joke, and that she wanted to see if I would be quick enough with an answer that would satisfy her. I wasn't. I don't, because I rejected the premise, but I appreciate that their mind is free enough to think in those terms, and I'm hopeful that they can continue along that road.
Well, I mean, I love how, your face and everything just like, you just light up when you're talking about your daughters, because they sound fantastic. And I think, creativity and like good sense of humor is so wonderful. And I love that you engage them with dad puns, dad jokes. That's
Yeah.
that's awesome. I think, that's probably listed in your, dad responsibilities and duties, to
For sure.
try to like, send a pun here and there. And yeah, and and that's a great question, right? I think it shows like how the way that your daughters view the world is just fundamentally different from how you view it, and that's okay, you know? And
Yeah.
so it's like that kind of like little that black box of like opening it and being like, what's going on in there? Having that
Hmm.
curiosity to lean forward and actually like look, I think is really important. And yeah, and I think your response about the what your daughter said about the bad jokes or dad jokes, yeah, I reject that premise as well. I think there is something to say about badly told dad jokes, right?
That's true. Yeah,
The
it's a
way
skill.
that the delivery is important
Yeah,
and the timing. Yeah. So
timing is very important.
yeah, exactly, right? Because if you were to take the
Yeah.
same dad joke, and just kind of like have a computer like monotone voice just read it out, it's not going to do anything, right? So
No.
yeah. Anyway, but there's layers to it. There's layers to it. And I commend your daughter for being able to like kind of respond with like it's almost like a quip. It's like, well, what about this? And then you're just like, whoa, what's going on? Yeah, no, because I think that this question about how you how you engage with your daughters and like thinking about the way that you grew as well. I mean, I think it all plays into like our actions, right? Whether that be in personal spheres or even like the professional sphere as well. But our actions really dictate, not dictate, but it reflects our sense of like what matters to us. And so the way that you are kind of like being very curious and like playful and like interested with your daughters and how they're developing is really important. And in the same way, within the professional sense, you're also trying to engage in a similar capacity, albeit one where now these are like adults and they have certain expectations and like there's certain boundaries, but like you're still trying to kind of like create an atmosphere of creativity, right? Create this sense that like it's okay to ask those questions because that's how we're actually going to get work done. And the sense of like, collectively advancing just another step towards yeah, new insights, right? New ideas, things of that nature. So I feel like all of that really resonates with global citizenship. And the last piece that you brought up was about your Muslim faith. Kind of the pastoral duties that you do every single day, right? That you've been engaged with. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of yeah, that experience for you. And is there any tie-in with some of these other points that we've discussed in terms of like linkages between how you navigate your professional career with again the like curiosity and the like high level of engagement with the questions that come about, and the same thing with your family. But like if you can maybe share a little bit more, because I think religious faith is such an incredible anchoring of like who we are. And it allows us to ask actually some of the biggest questions, right? Like, why are we even here? What's the point of all of this?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more if that's okay.
Yeah, you bet. So, first, let me kind of start with how a responsibility like that comes together, right? Like, how do you actually find yourself in a position to do that? So, within the community of interpretation that I land on, as being Muslim is Shia Imami Ismaili. So that's kind of the bounds of uh, the practice that we have in place, right? And the way that you become somebody that delivers pastoral care in that sect is that the imam, for which there's one at a time per world, right? So there's one now, and once he passes, then another one will be named. But the idea is there's only one for the world, and then he will select based on his various congregations around the world, um, uh, usually 2 to 4 people at a time to lead his congregation, depending on like the dynamics of that group. Uh, the people that are selected to serve in that capacity have no advance notice. So when I learned that I would serve in this capacity, there's no like, hey, would you like to do this kind of thing? You just hear your name announced in part of service, and now you are on deck for the next 3 to how many ever years that the community needs it, right? And so overnight you go from being kind of a civilian to being a leader of the congregation, and now you have these added responsibilities, and everything else about you is the same, but in this capacity, people are now looking up to you. They're expecting you to have answers that are not just very difficult, but some things that just may not have answers, right? And when you're engaging with community members and parts of the people in the congregation, you have to be sensitive to the idea that they're they are a part of the group because they're trying to live through something, right? It may be hardship, they may be celebrating something great, or whatever the things may be on that spectrum, but they're coming to you with an intention in mind, and it is not your responsibility to judge the intention. It's just your responsibility to give them peace, however that will come, right? And that will be different for different people as they navigate, their lives and different milestones. Parents having kids going off to college and they're kind of uncertain about that. You have, elders that are kind of navigating older age and having less mobility and freedom, and that's those sorts of things. Young couples trying to get together and get married and other things. So everybody has like a different thing that they're trying to figure out, but they're also trying to see like how can they integrate that with something bigger that won't change, right? Like most of the time, people when they engage with the faith, they normally stick with that for an extended period of time, and so they're trying to figure out how do you live within the context of these principles, right? And one of the pieces that really jumps out at me and that I've stuck very closely to, and it transitions well, not just in the faith side of the equation, but also professional and social, personal type space, is the idea of pluralism. Right? I know that we talk a lot about like inclusion, making space for people that are different than you, and having a seat for them at the table. And I like to think a little bit ahead of that with pluralism, with the idea being that I think it's not just my responsibility to make sure there's a seat at the table for people that have different ideas than me, but also that I need to figure out ways to promote them in whatever ways are important to them. I'm not trying to convince them that my way is better or has more merit. My goal is to help them figure out how can they develop their ideas more. And so in that way, it's kind of a mutual responsibility, right? That we're not just here to understand each other and leave it at that. We're here to understand each other, but also contribute to each other, that there is a reciprocity there. And I think when we think about it in terms of a social responsibility that I might have to a congregation, or as a father to daughters or students to their schools, however you want to think about it, that you have to think in terms of how can you promote the people that you're engaging with, how can you promote the communities that you're engaging with, and that's a place that I spend a lot of my time thinking about, and I think it's shaped quite a lot of the decisions that I've made.
Wow, that was beautifully said. Wonderful. I think that, the way in which you spoke about your pastoral duties, I mean, how you got to that point, and then what it means to you and the community. There's never a like, a me, like it's just a solitary, like, oh, it's about me. It's really this kind of like deeper engagement of how both are uplifted, right? Both are given a certain sense of peace, right, and contributing back to to each other's lives, in recognition that, ultimately, from what it sounds like, there's this common source that's shared, right? And Yeah, and then, it also got me thinking about, in your capacity as a father, in your capacity as a director, and also in this capacity within the communities of interpretation, right? What your role there is. It's about, in many ways, like the kind of guidance and like support that is offered to allow people to come with these questions, and through that interaction, provide a certain level of peace, right? That they can feel that, okay, this is starting to make somewhat of sense. It's not the answer, but it's definitely, it's part of the journey that they're going through, that we're all going through. Um, okay, wonderful. Well, we are coming up on time, unfortunately. This has been a really like stimulating conversation, and I've learned so much more about you, Salman. But I wanted to ask this final question. It's one that I ask all my guests, and it's either a book or a movie recommendation, something that you feel like might be appropriate for the listeners to engage with, in light of our conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. A couple of books that come to mind, and you'll see maybe some parallels between some of the comments that I've made and things you might find in these books. The first one is going to be around psychological safety, right? Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson. I know that's more on the professional side of the equation, but there's strong parallels to be drawn in people's personal lives and uh, families and things. But the idea is that you make spaces psychologically safe for people to be their authentic selves. And when they are that way, then you have the opportunity to learn much more and to learn more deeply. And I think, as I think about some of the things that my kids might do, or some of the things that my team members might do, I want to make sure that I take away the fear aspect of it. Some things will work, some things won't. Either way, we're going to be here the next day, right? So let's figure out, what are the best things we can spend our time with. Some of those things are going to be things that are of interest to us. Some things may just be, we just got to get it done today and move on, kind of thing. But the idea is that folks are comfortable being their complete selves. And when they agree with something, they'll tell you. When they disagree with something, they'll tell you. But the idea is you and them will stay, right? So I think that the relationship aspect is important. The other things, the other books maybe that I might be able to draw attention to would be, um, there's one that I think about quite a lot. It's called How We Decide by Jonah Lehrer, and it's a neuroscience book on how people make decisions. Like, what are the factors that are influencing you as you make any decision? And so it goes through like small stories around how different groups made different decisions and what were contributing to their influences there, and how those decisions might have come out differently had any of the factors been different. And so it's a really interesting read. I think I've read it at least a couple of times. And then I also spend a lot of time with work from Malcolm Gladwell, so Outliers and Blink, along the same pathway, right? That we have a lot of these influences, and those influences will shape the decisions that we make, and by extension, the actions that we take. And being able to better understand those, I think, going back to your comment about bringing people comfort and peace, you may not be able to explain why it's happening, but you feel okay that it happened differently. And being able to be in that space just frees up your mind to do some of the other things that you would find enjoyable otherwise.
Amazing. Great recommendations. I haven't heard of the first two, the Fearless Organization and like How We Decide, but I have read books by Malcolm Gladwell, and he's great. So thank you so much, Salman. This has again been wonderful. It's been a really amazing opportunity to like learn about your many you know the accomplishments, of course, but more importantly, this kind of like sustained inquiry along this journey that you've taken, and how through that process you've been really able to like build greater communities, right? And be able to contribute back in meaningful ways to those communities. So I really appreciate you taking this time to share your story. And yeah, I wanted to give you the final word before we sign off.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for organizing the work that you do. I think the question of global citizenship is a super important one, and it's a very unique one that doesn't get the attention that it actually requires, right? I think as we navigate some of the spaces that we spend our times in, obviously everybody spends their time in different places thinking about different things, but I think a lot about how do we um, draw ourselves into groups and how do we define borders, right? So we affiliate with certain things and we don't affiliate with others. But the idea is that as we start to expand those borders, as we make those boundaries bigger and bigger, we're going to see instances in which how you've defined the boundaries of your group will bump up against the boundaries that some other group has defined. And in some cases, you may accept to incorporate some of those ideas. In some cases, you may reject those ideas, but but the the short of it is that they will continue to exist with or without your knowledge. And so the more that you can tap into those and have a better understanding of why they're there, how they got there, and if there's a place for you to accommodate some of those things, then I think we'll all spend our time in a better place.